All right, so we're going to be in chapter 8 tonight, but before we do that, I want to wrap up a couple things from chapter 7. So if you've got your question sheets there, go back to the lesson 15, because there were a couple questions we didn't get to, and I looked back at them and thought those are definitely worth covering, so because I think they really tie in a lot. So remember, just since it wasn't what you're studying, just real quickly, this was the vision he had of the four beasts, and the Ancient of Days came in judgment, and the Son of Man came and was given a kingdom that was also given to the saints, and that received all the power and dominion of all of the earthly kingdoms. So that's kind of the general view of that vision. We talked about the nations that it means and what was going on. But I want to hit a few things at the end of this. Let's look at the very last question, question 9. I asked you to consider the descriptions of God on his throne. So if you look in verses 9 and 10, I watched till thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. His garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. And so I ask you in that question, what does this portray about God? It's an important part of this whole vision. I know that's not what was in your head coming into class tonight, but even just reading that, what does that, just in general, what does that portray about God? The power. There's absolute power seen there. Very different from the, I mean, when you contrast that to the other kingdoms we've seen portrayed as beasts, it's very different from that, right? They had a certain form of power, but this is like, you can tell right away this is power that far exceeds anything that they even would have, right, Jenny? Purity, righteousness. We see several things there. The whiteness that would symbolize that. The pure wool on his head. Judgment. You see kind of wisdom portrayed within that too. His throne being a fiery flame, wheels of the throne of burning fire, fiery stream coming out of it. That's imagery that you see in Ezekiel also. But this just portrays how far above everything else he is, how holy, how righteous, how wise, that he's far above all of these other nations that we've been looking at. And that's an important part of this vision. I asked you also on question 8, there's several different verses there, and for the sake of time I won't go through and read all those right now, but I asked how those verses tie this vision together with our general theme, that God is in control. There's several different things that are kind of given in those. We talked a little bit about verse 2. The four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. Verses 9 through 14 is that what we just saw of God. It also talks about the Son of Man coming and being given a kingdom. Verse 18, the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess it forever and ever. 22, judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High against the beast. So how do all those things tie together with our theme? Jenny? Yeah. Yeah, so this is above all of the visions on earth. It's above the kingdoms. And God's the one that's in control of all this, right? You see him executing all this from the beginning of it with the nations coming up, his four winds stirring up the sea, to the point that he makes judgment and gives the kingdom to the saints. So he's in control of all of that that's happening. So from an earthly standpoint, it may not feel that way. And we see persecution being portrayed here. But in reality, God is in control of what's happening and controls the ultimate outcome. And so that fits completely with the theme. And that's why I think that vision of him on his throne fits with that too. It just shows he's high above everything else, and it doesn't even compare to him in any way whatsoever. Okay, one other thing I want to hit here, because it's a little bit confusing, but let's talk about it, and then we'll move into chapter 8. Look back at verses 11 and 12 of chapter 7. So Daniel says, I watched then because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking, and that's the one on the fourth beast. I watched till the beast was slain, and its body destroyed and given to the burning flame. But then he says in verse 12, as for the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. What in the world is that talking about? Because we talked about that each of those kingdoms represents successive world powers, right? Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and then Rome. And yet he says this fourth beast was destroyed and given to the fire, but the other three beasts had their dominion taken away, but their lives were prolonged. Does that mean that those three kingdoms still exist, or still existed? Is that what he's talking about? little confusing, isn't it? Anybody got a stab at it? Okay, well, I'll tell you what it seems to me. Obviously, these were successive kingdoms. We've talked about that. But what's happening here with the power? What's Daniel's, the point God is making to Daniel about the power and dominion of those kingdoms? It's for a limited period of time, and ultimately, he's given all of the power and dominion of all the world kingdoms to his kingdom, right? Just like in the vision back in chapter 2. And so none of those kingdoms have any power. The one that's slain and destroyed is the one that represents Rome, that it's a world power that's controlling and defeating the saints. But he lets nations live on. So those other three don't represent those specific three nations in that sense. It's just that nations continue to live on. There's still nations and world governments. But he's taken their dominion and power away when he took away Rome's, that there's not another nation like that controls and will try to defeat the church in that regard. So it feels kind of weird. Again, it's like a dreamlike vision because these were successive kingdoms, and yet at the same time they're representing all of the kingdoms. So that's, I think, the best interpretation that I can come up with on that. So we'll leave. That may not be satisfying to you, but I do think that's what it means. For the sake of time, we're going to move on into chapter 8. So you can turn there. And let's talk a little bit about, as we get into this chapter, just briefly, the language that it's written in. I mentioned this early on at the beginning of the class, and it's not a critical thing to understand it by any stretch of the imagination, but this is the point where the language changes back to Hebrew. So remember, the first chapter was written in Hebrew, and then the first 3.5 verses, it goes in the middle of verse 4 of chapter 2 when it says that they spoke to the king in Aramaic, and then it switched to Aramaic. So from chapter 2, verse 4, it was Aramaic through to the end of chapter 7. Now we go back to Hebrew. And that's actually confirmed by the Qumran or Dead Sea Scrolls. When those were uncovered in the last century, they were written the same way, that it switches in languages there. So it fits with what was there before. An interesting point that I brought up before, maybe it'll make a little more sense now, but the Hebrew that's written now is not a very elegant style. It's a little bit rudimentary, apparently. I'm not an expert on any of this. But the Aramaic was very elegant in its form. But now we go back to the Hebrew, and it's kind of a rougher Hebrew. How would that fit with what was going on for Daniel, where he'd been living? Yeah. He's been in a country that speaks Aramaic, writing in Aramaic. He's representing of the government, so he's going to be doing everything in that official language. And so his Hebrew's going to be rusty, right? So he's not going to be fluent and literary in writing that like somebody that had been living in Israel for their whole life before the captivity. So it fits with that. Yeah, it may be. Now, a lot of them may have been together, depending, we don't know where they were living. There's not a lot that we know about that. So maybe people that were together would have actually spoken it well, or maybe even written it well. We don't know. But certainly Daniel was separated from them. But if they were kind of scattered through the whole kingdom, then it's probably that way for all of them, that their Hebrew had become rougher because they were speaking Aramaic instead as well, probably too. So we don't know that part of it. That could be very true. So I ask you, though, relative to that in chapter 1, how can that maybe help us to interpret what this vision's about his audience, and what the meaning of the vision is? It doesn't tell us for sure, but it's a little helpful to know, because it does give us a little bit of a hint about the intent and meaning. Yeah, it's probably intended to a Jewish audience, because the other stuff was more related to the world and world history, and this is more Jewish related. And we'll see that ties into what's talked about, what we're specifically told this vision was about. It fits with that. But that would kind of help us to know that a little bit. So it wasn't really designed to tell us about some future event thousands of years from now that still hasn't even happened yet. That's not the intent of this vision. It was something for the Jews, just looking at that alone. And that's actually a fragment of Daniel from one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's not my Bible. All right, so what year of Belshazzar's reign did this vision occur to Daniel? Third year. Yes, it says the third year of Belshazzar's reign. So if we look at back at the timeline that we have, Belshazzar Nabonidus, actually, his father reigned the last 17 years of Babylon, so starting around 556 BC. And it was about 3 years after that that he left and gave Belshazzar the power, controlled the kingdom as the second ruler. So that would be roughly 553 BC. So this would have been around 551. And again, that depends on what he meant by the third year, because we talked about that maybe that would actually be the fourth year if the first year was the 0 year. But somewhere in that 550, 551 BC time frame would be roughly where this occurred. So kind of keeping that in mind, we're going to talk about the interpretation a little bit more in this class, but mostly we're going to cover that on Wednesday night and get into the interpretation of the vision. We're kind of laying some foundation tonight. But this vision goes on to describe the Medo-Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, mentions Alexander the Great, and then looks way down the road towards Antiochus Epiphanes. And I'll just tell you now, for like the last 20 years, I have heard this and I've pronounced it Antiochus, so I'm going to slip and say it that way. I found out recently it's actually apparently pronounced Antiochus. And so I will try to remember that, but I guarantee I'm going to slip up. But it points way down the road to him. So if we look, here's when Daniel has the vision, go way down this way, follow the timeline, and here's Antiochus Epiphanes in this area. So we're looking way down the road at that point. So I ask you in question 2, how many years from the time the vision was given until all these things transpired? Don't have to be exact. This is not meant to be an exact answer, but yeah, somewhere in the 300 plus years, right? Because we were going from 551 all the way down here to the 163. So you're getting closer to 400 years in the high 300s for all that to happen. So that's a long time frame. So kind of back to some of the things that we spent a lot of time talking about in some earlier classes. Why would it be important for somebody who doesn't want to believe in God, doesn't want to believe the Bible is his inspired word? Why would it be important for them to prove that Daniel wasn't written way back when Daniel said it, when it claims to be? Way back here. Why would that be important? Yeah. 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 I mean, if Daniel really wrote that, then it's inspired, right? There's no question. So they have to work to disprove that. That's why it's important to them. Okay. So where did this vision take Daniel? It's not on your question sheet. I just asked you just now. Where does it take him? Yes. Depending on your translation, it may be worded Susan, Susa, Shushan. There's different spellings depending on the translation you have. But it's interesting. So this is Babylon right here. So you can think of the crescent. Jerusalem and Israel is going to be way over here. Here's the province of Elam, and there's Susa right there, or Sushan. And here's where the Median area, here's the Persian area. So Susa or Sushan was the citadel in the province of Elam, is what he says, by the river Ulai. So this was east of Babylon and Persia. Some people say Daniel was actually physically taken there and then had this vision. I think the wording tells us more that he was there in his vision. I don't know that it really matters. But interestingly, this later became the administrative capital of the Medo-Persian Empire. Once Cyrus took over, remember Cyrus was Persian, and he took over and kind of controlled the Median portion of the empire. He actually established that as the administrative capital of the whole empire. And again, he liked to keep the Medians involved to kind of keep the kingdom united, but he made that the administrative capital. So Daniel goes to a place that down the road, not that many years, but down the road is going to become the administrative capital of the kingdom that he's been part of. The Ulai that he mentions was a canal about 300 yards wide that had been dug to connect two rivers, the Choastes and Copertes rivers. And Ashurbanipal's inscriptions mention this location in a battle that he won in 636 BC. So it is a real place that he goes to, and it's a place that he's probably going to spend some time in later on when he's part of Cyrus's empire. And he may have actually been there already, because it probably was already a established city that had importance for Cyrus in a few years to make this his administrative capital, because that's only 20 years down the road that happened. So it's probably already a place that he had visited on some of his duties that he had as a high executive in the kingdom. All right, so let's get into the vision a little bit. I gave you a whole bunch of information on the sheet, the historical information that hopefully was helpful to you. You don't have to understand that to understand the vision, but it can be helpful, and we'll talk about some of that as we go through this class, and some of this will come into play in the next class. But we're not going to go through all that in here. You can probably read, so I'll let you read that on your own. I'm not going to read it to you. But let's look at question 3. I ask you just to summarize the primary vision that Daniel saw. What was his vision? Yeah, there's a... Oh, the goat charged the ram, actually, didn't it? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so there's a ram that has two horns. One's higher on one side. We saw that with the bear in the last chapter. Interesting that that's kind of a real common symbol that's used, so it's been important. And then there's a goat. What's notable about the goat? One horn. It's got one prominent horn, right? And it charges the ram and destroys it, right? The ram just can't stand up against it and it tramples it. And then what happened? What happened to the horn? It broke. And then what happened? Four horns come up in its place. And then something weird happens out of one of those horns, right? Something that we saw in the last chapter in a sense, but this is different. Yeah, there's one that pops up and starts talking, right? It becomes prominent. Where are we at here? Verse 9, one of them came a little horn which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and towards the glorious land. It grew up to the host of heaven, cast down some of the hosts and some of the stars to the ground, and trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away. So that's the vision that Daniel has, and again, we're seeing kind of a worded description of it. We don't get to see what he saw, but that tells us what he's looking at there. So I ask in question 4, what seems to be the primary focus of this vision? I think the reason I ask questions like that, and I think I mentioned this last class, I think it's really helpful when you're looking at confusing things anywhere, but in the Bible too, to kind of think through what are the facts, what do I know, what's clear here, and then we can focus on the other parts. So that's an interpretation. Yeah, that's an interpretation. So that we can take out of that. But there's kind of a focal point out of this vision. Where does what seems to be the thing that really captures your attention? Is it the ram? Is that what the focal point is? Yeah, there's the one horn that comes up at the end, right? That seems to be where everything's headed. The whole vision kind of leans towards that and focuses on that. And I pointed out here that verses 9 to 14 are about that in this vision. And then Gabriel spends verses 20 through 26 explaining what that is. So a whole bunch of this chapter is devoted just to that little horn, the things that it becomes great and what it's doing. And if you look in verses 13 to 14, the angels that are discussing it even help us to see that's the vision of it. Because Daniel describes this vision, and then he says in verse 13, I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, how long will the vision be? Look what he says now. Concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation. He tells us exactly what this is about. How long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, for 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. So they tell us what this is about. It's about that trampling underfoot of the sanctuary, of the sacrifices, and the transgression of desolation. So that's the focal point of this vision, referring to what that horn is doing as it becomes great. So they tell us it's on the little horn's opposition and the impact on the saints and the sacrifices. So that's the focal point of the vision. All right, I asked you in question 5, and this was a really poorly worded question. One thing I like to do is go back, I read the text when I'm getting ready for the class, because I prepare all this stuff well in advance, and then I look at my question sheet, and I read that one and thought, I'm not quite sure what I was asking. So I know what I was asking, but on my first read, I thought, okay, that means it's a poorly worded question, because if I didn't know exactly what it was right away when I've prepared it before, then you're not going to. The question I'm really wanting to ask here is what in general happens for Daniel regarding his understanding of this vision of the ram and the goat. Well, he doesn't understand it initially, but then what happens that aids him? It's explained to him, yeah, so the angels come and explain it. So he doesn't understand it, but then the angels come and explain it to him. So that's what's done for him in general to help him understand it. And there's a lot of explanation given here. I mean, the vision is just the very first part of this, right through like verse 12. And it doesn't start at the beginning, it's like verses 4 through 12. That's the vision. The rest of it after that is explanation for him. But the angels come and help explain it to him. And so the first two angels are discussing the time of the desolation of the sacrifices. Then Gabriel comes in and gives him more detail about what it all means. So again, next class is when we're going to discuss that detail. So if you're visiting with us just tonight, sorry. I guess you'll have to live stream in if you want to know what I say about that. But we're going to discuss that in the next class. But we're given an outline of the whole vision from that. So any questions about why that's the focal point of the vision? That's important. Anytime we're looking at a vision, you have to understand the focal point and some of the specifics about what's being talked about to understand the vision. We're going to talk about that more as we go through this class and even into the next class about it. But any questions about that before I move into some other thoughts here? Do you see why that, when you look at how the angels are talking about it, how that tells us that's what this is about? Because they say, how long will this be, this vision about this vision concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgressions? So that tells us where that focal point is. All right. Let's talk a little bit about apocalyptic imagery, because we talked about this the last couple classes. It's easy to maybe head down a wrong path if we're not really careful. I asked you in question 6, how can we be sure that we know what this vision is about? The angel tells him, yeah. So if they hadn't told us that, if we just got the first 12 verses, we're going to be left wondering, just like Daniel, right? We're going to be scratching our heads saying, what in the world is this about? And we could maybe assign all kinds of things that are or aren't accurate to it. But we know what this one's about because the angel told Daniel what it's about. Yes? Sure. And that's because he's coming from God, a representative of God, right? I mean, anything that comes from God, we can believe. Gabriel's a representative of God. The rest of the Bible is, so anything that's there, we can believe. But yeah, it's interesting once you go through and see the few places that Gabriel specifically mentioned. So looking at that's an interesting study as well. So Daniel's told what this is about. There's no question. And what is he told about when this would be occurring? This last part, what the focal point of the vision is with the trampling of the sacrifices. What's the national time frame that he's told? Who's the nation? Greece, yeah. He says it's Greece, and then this kingdom comes out of that. So we know it's something that happens during the Greek time period, right? Because that's what the angel tells us. Again, we'll talk more about the specifics when we get to the next class. But I want to spend a couple minutes giving you some examples of why it's really important to interpret these sort of things correctly, to be careful and not just think, well, it's a vision, we don't have to, we can kind of assign what we want to it. I want to talk about why it's important. So I want to give you a couple examples. First, I want to talk about premillennialism. So I'm going to give you some excerpts. I have a commentary at home that I like to use just to understand some of the misunderstandings. It's by a man named Ironside. It's premillennial. This is false doctrine. So if you're watching on live stream, listen to me carefully. This is false, what I'm about to read to you. I'm not agreeing with this. But I want you to hear it so you can kind of start to see how it's easy to think the wrong way about certain things. So here's what he says, that this vision is that we might be enlightened in regard to one who is to play a very important part in the time of the end. He is destined to arise out of the Syrian division of Alexander's empire. Is that all correct? I mean, I know it's hard if you're not reading it, but yeah, that's correct so far. He goes on and says, for the present, and ever since the Roman conquest, the goat with the 4 horns has apparently been destroyed. Is that true? Yep. But here's where he goes astray. Just as the Roman Empire is to be revived in the last days, so we learn that 2 of the 4 horns of the divided Grecian dominion will reappear on the prophetic map in that time of trial. Out of one of them, that little horn will arise, who will be the bitter enemy of the returned Jews of that day. So what he's saying there is Rome's going to be reestablished. The Greek Empire, with these 2 portions of it, is going to be reestablished. The little horn is going to be the bitter enemy of the Jews who come back at that point in the time of the end. So that's what he's saying in this last part. Again, that's not true. He goes on to say the Roman little horn will be an apostate Christian in league with the personal Antichrist. And then he further says, the angel's words, I will make thee know what shall be in the last end of the indignation, verse 19. This is undoubtedly the end of the times of the Gentiles. And then he goes on to say, the little horn is the Ottoman Empire fighting the Jews and Christians, and that the little horn will also be the leader of the resurrected Grecian Empire. So there's a whole lot of stuff there that's not correct. He's saying, the Roman Empire is going to come back, the Greek Empire is going to come back with these 2 divisions. The little horn is basically the one that's persecuting the Jews. And he makes it specific and says the Ottoman Empire fighting the Jews and Christians is going to be working with the resurrected Grecian Empire. So I know you can't look at this and you haven't read the whole commentary. This is very representative of a lot of the premillennial thinking, though. So, and again, there's a lot of different angles that people who teach premillennialism follow. But can you see what the primary assumption is that takes this whole thing badly astray? And I'll tell you, it has to do with the end of times thing. So what's his primary assumption? It's way in the future, and he's thinking this end times is actually the end of the world when Jesus returns and establishes his kingdom on the earth, which has already been established. Just truth teaching. It's already been established. But he's saying Jesus is going to come back and establish his kingdom. That's the end times. So it's a misinterpretation of what the end is referring to in this chapter. He's misunderstanding what the end means. And then they take that all down this whole other path. And they say Jesus, failed in establishing his kingdom. He's going to come back and reestablish a kingdom in the end times. There's going to be an antichrist that persecutes. Rome's going to be reestablished. A whole lot of things that are conclusions they jump to because it's a misunderstanding of what the end times or the end really means. I know that you look at that and think, well, that's crazy, but it permeates our religious society and probably permeates some of our thinking in some degrees too. I want to give you a second example. A man named William Miller calculated from 457 BC. So he went back in here, and he picked 457 BC because that's when the decree of Artaxerxes to Ezra was given. So that's when he gave that decree that they could go back and rebuild in Jerusalem. He took each day of this chapter, where it says 2,300 days, which that word actually means evening, morning, so we'll talk about what that actually means in the next class. But he took that as 2,300. He took each day as a year, because what are we told in the Bible elsewhere? Each day with the Lord is 1,000 years. And so they took that as literal, and he says, okay, so each day is a year, is what they said there. And he ended with 1844. And then he said that's the year Christ would return. And so because of the dating of when that decree was signed, they looked at October 22nd, 1844, and he and all of his followers were prepared for Jesus to return that day. They were all dressed in white. Some of them were actually on housetops. But guess who didn't return that day? Jesus did not return that day. So that led to a splintering into several religious groups. People came up with different conclusions. So the primary group that came out of that was the Seventh-day Adventists. And what they said was Jesus actually did return that day, but it was spiritual, not physical, and he returned to enter the second apartment of the heavenly sanctuary, is how they term it. So you have a whole religious group that was started out of that misunderstanding of a calculation of what the meaning was about. Also out of that group came the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Advent Christian Church. So you've got two very large and three religious denominations that came out of a misunderstanding of that prophecy and what that all meant. And the one that we're reading about for tonight's class. So again, there's a lot of assumptions there that are incorrect. What are some of the incorrect assumptions in what he was doing with his calculation? What did he think the end referred to? The return of Jesus. So he's looking at when it talks about the end here and says, well, that's got to be the return of Jesus. And so they're calculating that. What else were some incorrect assumptions there? Yeah, so he took some numbers literally that aren't maybe intended to be literal, maybe they are, but he took them literally, but then he transformed that into something else, right? It tells us 2,300 days, or evening mornings. He transformed that into 2,300 years, right? What else? How did he know when to start the clock in 457 BC, when that decree was given? He picked that, right? Are we told anything about that in this vision? Okay. So I want you to keep that in mind for a minute. I just want to illustrate what can happen when we take something the wrong way. And I know you'd look at that and think, well, that's crazy. They've got followers. Well, what if I'm up here teaching the wrong thing tonight? And that leads you to misunderstand things and where that can lead. That's what happened with these people. Somebody misunderstood it, started teaching the wrong thing. It led to a whole group of people that believe the wrong thing. Premillennialism, there's a lot of people that misunderstand that, and again, it's a lot of disastrous teachings relative to understanding God and Christ and their purpose. The same with these other denominations. So it can lead us down a wrong path. It's important that we don't make those kind of mistakes. So I asked you in question 8, I said the wording that seems to be most difficult or misused or misunderstood here is the time of the end, if you look at verse 19. He says, "Look, I am making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation, for at the appointed time the end shall be." And that's reading from the New King James. Your wording will be a little bit different depending on the translation you have. So I ask you in part A of that question, just so we understand this, because this will happen to us every time. Where does your mind tend to jump when you read the time of the end? What's the natural thought for all of us? The end of the world. When Jesus returns, end of the world, right? So that's where our mind jumps right away, and that's what we initially think about. But I asked you to look at all of, in part B of this question, I asked you to look at all of verse 19. Let's look at verses 13 first. Read verse 13. "Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, How long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot?" And then look at verse 26. "And the vision of the evenings and mornings which was told is true. Therefore seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future." So that begins to tell us right there what it's about. What does the angel say in verse 13 it's about? We're looking really at part B of your question now. The end of what? Yeah, this temple worship, these sacrifices, right? Verse 19, he kind of tells us that too. It's a little bit odd the way it's worded. He says, "Look, I'm making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation." So he's referring back to what he'd already talked about in verse 13. So it's not about the end of the world. It's about this time period where they weren't able to sacrifice. He told us that in verse 13. So that's the end of that they're concerned about here, is the end of the cessation of being able to sacrifice. Does that make sense? Let me make a couple other comments here relative to the end, but before that, I made a point to you in the verse here to read, if you use the NIV, to read it from one of the other translations, because the NIV words it a little differently. I do want to make a comment about translations. The ones that I have listed there are literal translations, where the ESV, New King James, and New American Standard are kind of word-for-word translations. The NIV is more thought translations. But there's a lot of use today of paraphrase translations. And I think you need to be really careful, especially in things like this, because if you've got a group of people who believe premillennialism, and they're interpreting, and writing it, and it's not a literal word for word, you're going to get some of that premillennial teaching built into what you're reading in the Bible. And so just be careful if you're using one of the paraphrase type versions. You might want to look in some literal ones when you're looking at any of these books that have prophecy where somebody may misuse and teach premillennialism. So just a thought for you. I want to make a comment too about the end. This phrase, the end, is mentioned multiple times in Daniel. We see it in this chapter. We're going to see it in the next chapters coming up, the next few chapters. But never once in any of those does it refer to the end of time. It's never got that in view in any of the chapters. Each of those tell us what's envisioned, just like this tells us that the sacrifices have stopped, and when's the end of that going to be? Each one of us each chapter tells us what's in view, but it's never the end of time. You have to force it to reach that conclusion or jump outside of what it's telling you. So let me give you an example here in verse 17. He says, "Understand, Son of Man, that the vision refers to the time of the end." But he doesn't tell us the end of what, so you have to look at all the context to figure it out. But if you just read that verse, our mind's going to jump to the end of time, right? So you have to look at the context and see what else we're told. Verse 19, we've already looked at. The end of the indignation or wrath is the answer. Verses 13 and 26, when you look at those together, it's the loss of worship, the loss of sacrifice. When is that going to end? The inability to worship and sacrifice. Yes? Of the end, yes. Yes. Makes a big difference in what it actually means. Our mind still jumps to the end of time, but he's saying the time of the end of something. We have to look at the end of what? So he's talking about the end of what they're talking about, these sacrifices. And it could be something else. And we'll see in some other chapters, it actually means something different. We're going to see as we get to chapter 11 and 12 that he's actually talking about a similar thing, but it's further down the road. It's in like AD 70 as part of what's in view at that point in time. So we're going to see some other things talked about, but it's never the end of time when the world ends and ceases in the book of Daniel. Yes, sir. Yeah, here he's talking about the end of the desecration of that. And we'll get more into that in the next chapter and kind of the history that ties into what he's talking about here with Greece. Because the temple was reestablished after Greece, right? We know that. And it was operational when Jesus walked the earth. Yeah. So because he's talking here about this are the things that happened out of part of the Grecian kingdom, it can't be the things that happened with the Roman kingdom because that didn't happen yet. But there was an event where this happened during the Grecian kingdom, so we'll talk about that as with Antiochus Epiphanes. I'm going to struggle with that. If you've been saying something wrong for all your life, you're never going to fix it, I don't think. All right. Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'll give you an example that's maybe a little bit parallel to this. During the time of COVID, whatever your feelings were about what should or shouldn't have been happening worship-wise in that time frame, none of us were really worshiping regularly, were we? There were different ways and different congregations that we were handling that, but we might talk about when is the end of that. That doesn't mean the end of all time. It doesn't mean the end of all worship, but when is the end of worshiping in that way going to be? When's the time of the end? So it's a similar thing here, that their end, though, was that they weren't able to worship at all because the temple had been totally, not in the temple sacrifices anyway. They could worship individually, but they couldn't have temple worship because that had been totally desecrated. So, yeah, it's a real similar concept of any of those things, the end of something besides the end of time, or as Carl pointed out to us, the time of the end. I want to point one other thing out to you relative to this. If you look in verse 26, if you use the New American Standard, it says that, Jenny, you use the New American Standard, don't you? What's verse 26 say? Yeah, so it says keep the vision secret, but the other main translations, the literal word translations, use the phrase seal up the vision or shut up the vision. That's actually a phrase, seal up, that means to preserve it, just like you would seal a document so that it was kept and preserved. It doesn't mean to hide it, so the wording there in the New American Standard is a little bit confusing, maybe misleading. So it's actually being preserved for the future is what it means. And that would kind of imply it's being hidden from the future, but it's there to be used and understood is what the meaning of that tells us. It's for the knowledge of those in the future time. So ultimately the end, we're told from the context, we're told from the wording, is clearly referring to the end of the stopping of the sacrifice that a king of Greece caused. So a king of Greece causes a stopping of the sacrifice. When is that stopping going to end? Is what this is about. Yeah, we'll talk about that in the next class. There's a lot to think about behind that, and there's a couple different thoughts on that. And I'll just tell you up front, I can't say here's exactly what it means. I don't think we can do that. But there's some things that actually make a lot of sense that we can talk about. And that may actually be a literal meaning there. There's some other literal things in this. It may just be figurative. We'll talk about both of those. Let's look at question 7. And this is something we talked about in the last couple classes. I kind of teasingly was poking fun at Jenny and Jonathan about pointing out you're saying this is symbolic and yet this makes it sound like it's literal. Those are important questions. When we're looking at symbolism, it's important to understand what's symbolic, what's intended to be taken in a, kind of, even within the symbolism, it has a literal meaning to it. So I ask you in this question, just kind of reading through it, because we're told here that certain things have a literal meaning, right? Like the 4 horns are 4 different leaders. There's a single horn that comes out of it, and it tells us that's a single king who's going to cause this problem down the road. We're told the ram is Medo-Persia. We're told the goat is Greece. So we're given some things that, even though it's symbolism, that have a very specific meaning to it. So the question is, in other apocalyptic visions, like the last chapter we read, Daniel 7, or if you're studying Ezekiel, or if you're studying Revelation, should we be assigning specific things to everything we see there? Should we look at each of those visions and say, well, each of these things must mean something specific, so I have to assign something to it? Are we being inconsistent when we say, no, that's symbolic? Carl? Yeah. Yeah. And I gave you some examples of that a minute ago, right? That's why I gave you those examples. If you assign things to it that we're not told, like the premillennials do, or the precursors to the Jehovah's Witnesses and Seventh-day Adventists, if we start assigning things that we're not told, you're going to go all kinds of different places with it, right? So we have to be very careful about assigning something if we're not told what it means. So one of the guidelines I suggested last class that I think is valid, if you look at it and say this is symbolic, these are not literal events that are happening, it's a symbolic vision, then it's symbolism, except where God says, I mean this part of it as a literal thing. It's still a symbolism, but there's a literal meaning to this symbolism that you can be specific. I shouldn't say literal, I should say a specific meaning to it. That's probably a better word. So it's symbolism, but parts of it may have a specific meaning when God tells us that's what it means. But that's why I went through those examples, because we can really go down a wrong path ourselves, but we can also lead other people astray ultimately if we believe something and teaching the wrong thing on it. Who knows how many people are going to end up following that. So we have to realize if it's symbolic unless we're told otherwise. Accept the things that we're told. Like here, there's some specifics given, so accept those specifics. And then also we have to examine the context. What's the wording, what's the context telling us what this is about? Just like this vision, they tell us what it's about, so we can't say, well, this is about the end of time, or it's about Jesus' return to establish another kingdom, because it tells us it's about when is this cessation of sacrifice is going to end. So that's what this vision's about. So we can't go beyond what we're told and assign other specifics to it. So is that all helpful, hopefully, to understand when we're looking at symbolism? Okay. So let's think about Daniel's responses. I ask you in question 9, what impact does this vision have on Daniel? Made him sick. He's wiped out, right? What's it say about what he's able to do? Well, he is able to understand it, but no one could understand it. He's able to understand part of it because he's told. If you look in verse 18, while he's getting this vision, while he's receiving it, what's it say about what happened to him? Sank into a deep sleep. It's like it almost knocked him out in a sense, right? And then in verse 27, as it was pointed out, he was sick. It says, I fainted and was sick for how long? Days. Yeah. And afterward, I arose and went about the king's business, which, interestingly, just a side point, I hadn't caught this before. This is during Belshazzar's reign, right? Third year of Belshazzar. What's he going about? King's business. So Belshazzar actually knew who he was, right? But when we get to the end of Belshazzar's reign, he'd kind of forgotten about Daniel's power just some 10 years later. So that tells you a little bit about Belshazzar. Nothing to do with this lesson, but it's just something that I had kind of missed before. So why do you think that had that impact on Daniel? I don't think that's given to us just because, that's an interesting thing that God threw into the story. There's some meaning to it. Yeah. So Daniel knowing this information about something bad in the future, the burden of that. Prophecy, what's that word mean? The actual word for prophecy. It actually means a burden. If you look at the original word, not our word prophecy, but I think is it the background word for oracle in Greek. I may be wrong, but I think it means a burden. But if I'm not wrong, it's still a burden. But he has a burden he's got to bear here, right? He understands something about the future. We don't really know why he hit him this way, but it's an intense amount of information about his people and something that's going to happen to them down the road. I mean, if you can just think about if you were told by God that, in so many years down the road, 200 years or whatever, he doesn't know how many, but at this point down the road, God's church is just going to be decimated and destroyed, even though it's going to still exist, and he's going to raise it back up. And you're given this information about what's going to happen, but you don't really know any of the specifics about it. That's going to weigh heavy on you, isn't it? I mean, if God's people is the most important thing to you, and you understand that about it, you're just thinking about, is that going to be some of my friends and family down the road, grandkids, things like that are going to be impacted by it. So it's a heavy burden to bear. And just as we walk out, it's pointed out that, in verse 27 that he arose and went about his business. He was astonished by the vision, but nobody understood it. So it kind of sounds like he talked with his friends about it, but nobody could help him to understand it either. He didn't know what it was about. So that's going to weigh on him too, because he's given this information that's heavy, but he doesn't really know what it means. We have the ability to look at history on this side of it and understand it better than Daniel did even. But it's heavy weighing on him. All right, so Wednesday night we'll talk about the meaning of all this.